Hey guys, it's Nep here, and this is my first video, and today I'm going to be talking about how to utilize feedback in a meaningful way to accelerate your learning, specifically with drawing. So, whenever you start out drawing, one of the first things that people obviously tell you is, oh, well, you need to take feedback, you need to take constructive criticism, and you need to understand what constructive criticism is. The issue is no one ever really talks about the types of feedback or really how to take feedback. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And we'll be talking first about three main types of feedback. And before I go further, I want to say that I get all of this information stuff from a book called Ultra Learning by Scott H. Young. I super recommend this book. It's the book that I used before I started trying to learn how to draw, and I've seen a mass acceleration in terms of how quickly I started to pick up concepts and how quickly my drawing started to improve. And it can be used for a multitude of skills that you might want to learn, whether it be graphic design or whatever. There'll be a link to the Amazon website that has the book, and I highly recommend it. So that's where I get all this information from. So as you see on the screen here, there's three different types of feedback that you can have. There's outcome feedback, informational feedback, and corrective feedback. And this is the main crux of feedback. You need to be able to understand the different types of feedback and what they're good for. Because if you try to use a certain type of feedback to get a certain type of response and to kind of push your learning in a certain direction, you might end up getting the wrong learning from it. And that's really where that stagnation and that sort of putting yourself in a rut can happen. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. For now, let me just give some quick definitions of them all. So, number one is outcome feedback. This is the essential, are you doing it wrong? So this is when you look at tests, it's pass fail, it's your grades, A, B, C, D, did you get an F in the class, whatever. This type of feedback gives you nothing but if you're doing something wrong. So that's to say, it doesn't tell me what I'm doing wrong. Yes, you might get marks on a math test saying that you used the wrong equation, but that's a different kind that I'll get into later. But just the grade itself just tells you that you're doing something wrong, right? It doesn't matter what it is, you're just doing something wrong. In terms of drawing, this type of outcome doesn't come up too much. The most often I can say is in terms of engagement. So if you have a big fan base, or if you're doing like a drawing, just kind of seeing like the like-dislike ratio, looking at comments, that's the best way to get this kind of feedback. I don't think for drawing it's the most useful. However, it can be super helpful to understand that something's going wrong. So moving on to the second type of feedback, this is the most common type of feedback, and I think the most misunderstood one. So informational feedback is, what are you doing wrong? So this type of feedback tells you specifically what you're doing wrong, but not necessarily how to fix it. So the best way to think of this feedback is when people look at a piece of art and say, oh, well, the head looks kind of off. That's not telling you how to fix it. It's just saying that they look at the head and it just looks kind of off to them. You mainly get this type of feedback from people, friends, especially in the drawing sphere. If you're putting your stuff on DeviantArt, random comments, other users, this is where a lot of your feedback comes from. And this is solely where the issue arises. This type of feedback is helpful. However, taking the quote-unquote fixes that these friends, family, users provide can often lead you to wrong solutions. And that's really where corrective feedback comes from. Corrective feedback is both the best kind, but also the hardest to get. It's often only available through teachers, coaches, etc. This is the type of feedback that you go into office hours at a university and you ask your professor, Professor, how do I fix this? And they look at your math problem or they look at your essay writing and they say, here's specifically what's wrong. In drawing, the best way I've seen this is finding both either people that are very knowledgeable about art to where they understand the fundamentals of what they're doing, or truly just finding coaches and teachers online. Art classes are super helpful for this kind of stuff. However, you need to obviously know the pitfalls of taking art classes and stuff. However, um, going more into the issues or the what I would call like further notes on feedback, um, you have to be careful. So I said at the beginning how the biggest issue is trying to use one type of feedback as something else. So the most common form of this is trying to act like informational feedback is corrective feedback. That those random comments that you get from friends and family, the quote unquote the head looks off and stuff like that, that is telling you how to fix a problem. It's not. um, they obviously are saying what they think in a very guessing kind of way. Corrective feedback is never a guess, it is always an absolute. It is always a teacher saying this is fundamentally how you do this. When you talk about perspective, a random user taking a guess on how to make something look better or more three-dimensional is not corrective feedback. You can take their explanation and you can run it by a teacher, or you can take their explanation and you can do research experimentation, but understand that it is never going to fill the gap that this corrective feedback holds. And that needs to be super clear. And I think this is the biggest pitfall that a lot of people come into when they get into art and anything in general. They're told time and time again by professionals, by YouTube videos, by random people, oh, you need to just put your art out there, right? Oh, your art doesn't look good, but you just need feedback. The issue is they don't themselves know how to give good feedback. So, for example, for my ultra learning project. So here's just a basic picture of the start of my project and sort of the end. December 19th was really when I started truly trying to make art. This was the first freehand drawing I did. And then January 9th was the last picture I've done. As you can see, it still looks poor, right? My January 9th drawing is not amazing. However, it is a massive step up from my December art. And the reason is because I used feedback in a meaningful way. So I was home from university at the time, and so the only real access I had to feedback was professionals on Twitter that I would message about specific questions I had, and my little sister who does art. Now, my little sister who does art is not, as I said over here, is not a professional. She's not a teacher. So she can't look at this picture and tell me specifically how to fix the horns so that they look more three-dimensional. She can't tell me how to shade better. Like, she might know these things, but there's a difference. She might be taking a guess on how to fix it. So instead, what I did with my sister is I used the second approach. I used her informational feedback to understand what I was doing wrong. So I would take a picture like this December one, and I would just pull her into the room and ask her straight up. And I would watch her facial expression very closely. Because I told her very candidly, don't lie to me, be very straight up. But you could tell from her facial expression immediately what was the issue, right? And that's the outcome feedback. That she walked in and she gave a grimace, right? So I could immediately tell I failed. That's that pass fail kind of outcome feedback that I was talking about. I knew immediately something was wrong. Now the question was asking to get feedback on what I was doing wrong. And she told me clearly. She said, what are these? Teeth? They look bad. These horns don't look right. The shading looks bad. Now I have a list I can make. So I went to my Word document and I typed out a list. I said, okay, 1, shading, 2, 3D, 3, perspective, etc., etc. Then I went on Twitter and asked some professionals and did my own research and experimentation, basically saying to professionals and stuff, what is the best way to do this? How would you go about fixing perspective? And I had friends and I had these professionals tell me, here's how they do perspective, here's how they do shading, here's the tips, which as you can see with this one, my shading was a much different. So instead of doing this very blended shading to get a more realistic look, which is good, this very subtle low opacity shading makes a much clearer picture of the perspective of it. It gives a clearer picture that this in here is a three-dimensional shape rather than flat. I still have a long ways to go, obviously, and there's a lot of issues with line art and whatever. However, it's very hard to claim that this work over here from December is better than my January work. And this has only been a month, which to me has been good progress, but obviously there's a lot more to go. So now that we've talked about the 3 types of feedback, we should go into some ways of improving your feedback. Because again, we talk a lot about, oh, you need to get feedback, but how do you actually use that feedback? And so again, going back to the book I referenced earlier with Ultra Learning, he gives 4 types of tactics for feedback. So the first tactic is noise cancellation, which is exactly what it sounds. All feedback is useful. So going back to the example of my sister, the feedback that she gave when she gave a grimace was helpful. But I have to shift the good from the bad. I knew my sister had preconceived biases in terms of art. She's an artist herself, and I'm just starting out. So I knew she was going to have issues with giving me truly helpful advice because she might have her own like superiority complex with it. That's not to say that she did, but that's something to keep in mind. Being able to look at feedback and thinking what might be the unhelpful parts that you need to shift through is super important, and it's the best way to get helpful feedback even out of those really bad DeviantArt comments that look like nonsense, that just say, this is awful, I hate it, right? There's not much there, but at least you get some sort of outcome feedback of like a pass fail. You know what I mean? This person gave you a fail. You know something went wrong. Now you just have to think, okay, now I shift through the noise. Is it just because they're a troll, or did I do something wrong? And this is where you create proxy kind of feedback. So you look at the other comments, you ask other people, you get a multitude of different feedback to understand if he's just a weird outlier, this person might just be a troll, or if what they're saying at least has some merit. And that's where that research comes in. And that's kind of the big thing with feedback. You need to do research. You need to explore further. Asking one person is not always going to help. You need to ask more people. You need to get more feedback, etc. Number 2 is hitting the difficulty sweet spot. And this one is pretty obvious. If I am a very seasoned artist, let's say it's your favorite artist on Twitter, and they came to you and they made just the simplest drawing. They made this drawing on the right? Let's say their line art is better and it just looks better. But there's low chance of failure because you know their skills are better than this. They can draw this in their sleep, right? Same thing of if I were to just make a stick figure. I can draw that in my sleep, and therefore the feedback isn't helpful because they're just going to tell me things I already know. Oh, it looks good. Oh, this is nice. Oh, it's kind of simple. I know these things already, and therefore that feedback's not helpful to me. So the best thing you can do is force yourself into harder, more difficult things. Things that you might not be prepared for. Things that might, scare you a little bit. But to some degree, you're ready for. That you can prepare for to some degree. However, you're not convinced they're going to give you what you want to hear. So again, going back to this picture here, this picture was difficult. I did something where I had to try to make it look 3-dimensional so that this made sense. So what I did was I put myself into a difficult position where the feedback that I got, while I knew was going to be about 3 dimensions and perspective, I didn't know if it was going to be good or bad because I don't know my own ability. And so then once I got feedback about this picture, I could go from there. Sorry if that was a little confusing. The third tactic is called meta feedback. So this is the kind of feedback where it isn't about your performance, but it's evaluating the overall success and of the strategy that you're using to learn. So as I said, I used Ultra Learning as how I was trying to learn to draw rather quickly, right? Ultra Learning was the strategy that I used to learn. And so I made this picture to understand how successful my learning was. And by looking at this, I can tell myself, yeah, that strategy was pretty successful. Yes, they're 2 different styles, but there's very subtle things that are much better in the second one that I couldn't do a month ago. And so making pictures like this is super helpful. It's why artists post them on Twitter all the time at the end of the year, because it helps them understand if they are getting better, and if they aren't, it's the strategy. I used one strategy to get from here to here. I saw massive improvement. Therefore, I know with Tactic 3 meta feedback that my strategy is good, and therefore I should continue that strategy in the future. It's not a feedback that you can tell other people. Obviously, other people give you feedback on the pieces, but it's something you have to look at and truly decide, do I feel happy with this outcome? Number 4 is high intensity rapid feedback. And this is the easiest to understand. It's the best way to improve feedback and get better feedback is to get a lot more often. So obviously this puts more work on you. It's harder to shift through, of course. It's harder to use tactic 1 and noise cancellation. However, getting more feedback gives you a better chance of getting better feedback. So this is why things like r/drawing is a thing. Why Reddit as a whole can be a thing. Why DeviantArt is a thing. Or why YouTube videos comment sections exist and why artists draw speed drawings on there. Is because you can get instant feedback in bulk from these people. Same thing with Twitter. Artists always post their art on Twitter for obvious reasons. Obviously, they want people to see their art so they can grow, but beyond that, they get more feedback that they can look through and find small things that they wouldn't find normally. You get a much larger breadth of feedback that you can then use noise cancellation to find the small things that you wouldn't have noticed at first. So if I were to ask one person to give me an evaluation of this drawing, they might say it was good. But if I ask 50 people, one of them might tell me that this line right here doesn't make sense, or that this skull shape just doesn't look right. If I didn't ask 50 people, I wouldn't get that comment, and that comment can help me then do further research to get better at this, to make this look better as a whole. So at the end of the day, feedback comes down to how you use it. We hear all the time as artists, use feedback, learn how to take feedback, learn how to take constructive criticism. However, if you don't learn what the type of feedback is, or how to best use that feedback, you're doomed for failure. And you're doomed to not learn correctly, which is the most important thing. We as artists strive to learn quickly and to get better at our craft. The best thing you can do to accelerate your learning and to become a better drawer faster is to learn the different types of feedback and to use these tactics to get better feedback. So that's going to be my video on feedback. I'm going to hopefully make some more in the future surrounding how to learn in general and stuff about drills and more specific content about shading and stuff. But if you liked it, I would really appreciate if you all subscribed, gave a like, and possibly share it with others, because I think this is a big topic that a lot of people don't correctly analyze that I think can lead to a lot of artists hitting bumps in the road.